This week's Torah portion takes off where last week's ended. Last week's Parsha ended with God giving Abraham the commandment of circumcision, to circumcise all of his family members, his male family members, and all his servants were all to be circumcised. And the very last verse of last week's Torah portion states the following: on that very day, Abraham was circumcised, and Yishmael his son. All the people of his household, those born in his house and those bought with money from foreigners, were circumcised with him. And this week's Parsha begins with the words, and God appeared to Abraham. It doesn't say Abraham, it says he appeared to him in the plains of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent, and it was in the heat of the day. And he looked around and he saw, look, 3 people were really angels disguised as people in front of him. And he ran towards them from the entrance of the tent, and he prostrated himself on the ground. And then he invites them in his house to serve them, and continues with how he provided them with a lavish meal and so on. So what's the connection between the end of last week's Torah portion, which talks about circumcision, and this week's Torah portion, which talks about God appearing to Abraham, and he's sitting at the entrance of his tent, and he sees 3 people? So there are actually 2 questions here. Number 1, what's the connection between circumcision and God appearing to him and this whole story with the angels? And number 2, it says God appeared to him, but God isn't in the picture anymore, at least not for many other verses, where it talks about how he's sitting at the entrance of his tent and he sees these 3 people, angels disguised as people, but he doesn't know that they're angels. He thinks they're people, and he invites them in, and he provides them with bread and a whole meal, a whole lavish meal. And the Torah goes into great detail about what these people / angels said to him, including a blessing that Sarah will have a child. What's the connection to circumcision? So Rashi says that this occurred 3 days after her circumcision, and God came to find out how he was doing. And this is one of the sources of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick. So this is a direct connection. Abraham is circumcised at the age of 99, and he's ailing, and the 3rd day, commentaries say, of a surgery as the most difficult day, and God therefore comes and he visits him. So then what does it have to do with the people, 3 people coming, and Abraham invites them to be his guests? So Rashi says further, when the Torah says that he's sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, what is the Torah trying to tell us? That because Abraham was ailing, God didn't want Abraham to be troubled by wayfarers, by guests. So God made it so hot that nobody in the right mind would travel in the desert at that time, so that Abraham shouldn't be troubled by any guests, any visitors. But Abraham was troubled even more because he loved to serve other people. He loved to show kindness. He was the most hospitable person, in contrast to the people of Sodom, for whom Abraham prayed, ironically, who were the most anti-guests people, most inhospitable people. But that's a separate subject. So here Abraham is troubled. He's in pain, not just physical pain, but he's in an emotional pain that he can't serve anybody. So what does God do? He can't send people because it was too hot for people to travel. So he sends angels disguised as people. And that's how the story picks up. So it's all about the aftermath of circumcision. But Rashi makes a statement, and this is taken from the Talmud, that this occurred on the 3rd day after he was circumcised. And that's when God comes to visit him. So the question is, how does Rashi know? How does the Talmud know that it was the third day? Well, it could be a tradition. It was passed down from one generation to another, as many things in the oral tradition. But the Rebbe points to an argument that it had to be the third day. It couldn't be the first day, couldn't be the second day, but it had to be the third day. Why? So the Rebbe explains that what happened on the third day is God appears to Abraham, and at the same time he sends these angels. One of the angels was the angel Rafael. Rafael means God's healer. He's the angel of healing. So this is the third day when Abraham was to be healed. Well, why can't it be the first day or the second day? And the answer to that is that if it was the first day or the second day, then it would have been an unnatural recovery. It would have been a miraculous recovery. And what is wrong with a miraculous recovery? Nothing is wrong with it, but it defeats the whole idea of a mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah, the idea of the mitzvah is that you're doing something physical within the parameters of a physical world. There are natural laws, and the whole objective is to take the physical world, the world of nature, and elevate it. If God wanted just to have spiritual ways of serving God, such as what we do when we pray, God would have not given us commandments that involve the physical world. God wants us to take the physical world, not escape it, take it, refine it, elevate it, and make it spiritual. So if a mitzvah is done through the medium of a miracle, that means that the mitzvah did not involve the natural world. It involved the supernatural world. And the Rebbe would refer to a story that happened with the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe. When he was arrested with trumped up charges that he was a revolutionary, that he was trying to overthrow the Tsar, that he was supporting the Ottoman Empire, which was at odds with Russia because he was sending charity to Israel, and Israel was then under Ottoman rule, and that he was setting himself up as a king, and so on and so forth, all these false charges by his enemies. And he was arrested, and he was being transported from one prison facility to another, and there was a waterway that separated between the two. So he was being rowed between one building and another, and it was at night. Now, at the beginning of a month, there's a Jewish law that requires that we say a special blessing for the moon, thanking God for the creation of the moon. And this blessing is said at night outside where you could see the moon, so that the Alter Rebbe knew that he was not going to have another opportunity to be outside, so he wanted to say the blessing, but he wanted to say the blessing in a tranquil atmosphere. So he asked the guard who was rowing the boat, could you please stop so I can concentrate on the prayer? And the guard sneered at the Alter Rebbe, says the prisoner is demanding special attention that he should be able to say his prayer, and he refused to stop. And the Alter Rebbe, who was a holy person, had the power, had the ability to make it stop miraculously, and it stopped, and he couldn't go. The boat didn't go any further. Now, when you say the blessing over the moon, there's a preliminary psalm, and then the real thing begins with the blessing. So he recited the preliminary psalm, and the boat started going again. In other words, the Alter Rebbe released whatever power he had to cause the boat to stop. He released that power and allowed the boat to go on. And then he says to the guard, could you please stop the boat? And this time the guard listened, and he stopped it without having to resort to a miracle. And the Rebbe explained, why is it that the Alter Rebbe had to start the process with a miracle, but he wouldn't say the blessing? He let the boat go on its own until he asked the guard, and the guard said yes, and he let the boat continue. So the Rebbe explained, because the Alter Rebbe was engaged in a mitzvah, And a mitzvah you don't do through a miracle, ideally, because you're not taking a physical experience and elevating it. You're taking a supernatural experience, and that's already elevated. You don't have to elevate it. So the Rebbe therefore says, if God would have come to visit him, and God, the healing of Abraham came through God via the angel. The angel was just an instrument, but God is the one who's doing the healing. If God would have come to visit and cause his healing on day 1 or even on day 2, that would have been a miracle. That means his circumcision defied the natural consequences of a bris. The natural consequences of a bris is for a person to be alert. That's why if it's a baby, we do not anesthetize the baby, because the whole idea of a bris, an adult, you have no other choice, but the whole purpose of a bris is it should be in the most natural way. And anyhow, the anesthetizing the baby is probably more painful than the actual bris itself, which, done by a mohel, is extremely quick, takes a few seconds, as opposed to doctors who do a bris with clamps and everything, which is probably a 15-20 minute ordeal, and it could be more painful than anything. Jews have been doing circumcision for 3,800 years. We perfected the art. But anyhow, getting back to God coming to Abraham on the 3rd day, because that would have been the day that by nature he would have been healed. But then the Rebbe asked the question, if that's the case, if it was natural for him to be healed on the 3rd day, why did God have to come to visit him? And why did God send the angel Rafael? And the answer is, everybody is healed by God through the instrument of the angel Rafael. But not everyone sees how that is happening. Abraham experienced the source of his healing by God coming to visit him. Now, the question I asked before, God appears to him, and then doesn't talk about God anymore. God appears to him in the plains of Mamre, and he's sitting at the entrance of his tents, and he sees these 3 people, these 3 angels, and he serves them, and he takes care of them, and they promise that Sarah's going to have a baby, and she laughs, and the people leave. And then they go towards Sodom, and Abraham escorts them. And all of a sudden, God comes into the picture again. God says, am I going to conceal what I'm going to do from Abraham? Abraham's going to be a great nation, and so on and so forth. He praises Abraham. And then he talks about how the people of Sodom are crying out for the pain that they're suffering and the sins that they were committing, and I want to go see what I can do for them. And then Abraham goes and argues to God about sparing the righteous people in the city of Sodom. So in between, God appears to him, and then all of a sudden God disappears, it seems, and then he comes back into the picture. So the Talmud says that this teaches us that greeting a guest is greater than welcoming the divine presence. Abraham was being visited by God. He had to welcome God. He's communicating with God. And all of a sudden, he turns his attention to these wayfarers who Abraham, as Rashi says, considered to be pagans, to the point that he wanted them to wash their feet before they entered the home, because there was a pagan custom of worshiping the dust of your feet. So he wanted them to get rid of that idolatrous trace. So here he's serving idolaters, lowly people, which in his mind he thought they were lowly people, and God is waiting. So this teaches us that serving guests is superior to welcoming God. What's the rationale behind that? Obviously, it's not an affront to God if you welcome guests, because you're doing a mitzvah, and God wants you to do the mitzvah. Why would he be upset that you're doing a mitzvah? What's the whole purpose of welcoming God in your midst, if not to do what God wants you to do? So my father, of blessed memory, once gave a beautiful explanation why it's greater than welcoming the divine presence. Because beyond welcoming the divine presence is being a partner with God. There are many different levels of our relationship with God. There's one level where we're receiving from God. We're welcoming God. God is the one who's giving us, and we're welcoming. But then there's a deeper level, a higher level, where God is actually our partner. We're God's partner. How does that work over here? So my father quoted a passage in the Talmud that a person who doesn't have a home is not a complete human being. In other words, a homeless person is a person who lacks the dignity of what it means to have a home. And what is the dignity? We have two personas. We have a public persona, the way we behave in public. There are certain rules of etiquette, how we behave, certain ways how we represent ourselves. And then there's the way we are in our personal life, the way we are as a private individual. That's where we are in our true essence. The way we are in public is the way we put on an act. Now, it's not a false act, but it's a different persona. It's not necessarily the way we are. Where could we be ourselves? Where can we express our essence? In our own home. That's where we are. We have our essence. A person who is homeless, in a certain sense, is worse than a person who doesn't have food. Obviously, a person couldn't survive without food, but a person who is struggling to get food on his table, that's a terrible, terrible thing, and we have to do everything in our power to help these people. But in a way, person not having a home is even worse, because it takes away that dignity. When a person travels and they're not in their own home environment, they are, temporarily at least, homeless. They don't have a place where they can call their home, where they could express their essence. So when you greet a person, a traveler, a guest, I'm not talking about inviting over a friend or a neighbor. I'm talking about someone who doesn't have a home temporarily. What you're doing is you're taking away their status of lacking their humanity, and you're giving them humanity. You're giving them the dignity of humanity by having a place where they can be themselves. That makes you a partner with God. God creates the person, and you are creating the person as well. God creates the physical person, and you are giving that person human dignity. And that's why you're a partner. So that's superior to receiving and greeting the divine presence. In this case, you are a partner with the divine presence. Later on, when the angels say that Sarah is going to have a child, it says Sarah laughed. She laughed. And God says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Is it something that I can't do? God can do everything. So the question is, how could such a righteous woman as Sarah laugh? If God tells you you're going to have a child, even though you're 90 years old and you no longer have the reproductive capability of having a child, but God can do everything, as God himself said. So the simple answer is that Sarah didn't hear this from God. Sarah heard this from these angels who were disguised as people who might have been pagans. So if someone walks into your home and you're 90 years old and they tell you next year you'll have a child, you laugh. You mock that, because why would anyone believe what a wayfarer, might have even been an idolater, tells you? But God still was upset, because a person should never laugh at a blessing that someone gives you, no matter how far-fetched the blessing seems to be. But there's a Hasidic interpretation given by the Sfas Emes, one of the Gerer Rebbes, who says that if you look at the text, and the text says, "Vatitzchak Sarah bekirba," that Sarah laughed within her. What does that mean? She laughed within her. So Rashi says she looked at her body, at her anatomy, and she says, I can't have children. But the Sfas Emes says it means that she laughed subconsciously. Consciously, she didn't laugh. She didn't mock or doubt God's ability to give her a child. But inside, deep down inside, there was a trace of doubt that she didn't even know that she had. That's why she denied it. She says, no, I didn't laugh. How could Sarah lie? We're talking about a holy woman, a woman who was superior to Abraham. God tells Abraham to listen to whatever Sarah tells her. Sarah was a greater prophet than Abraham. And yet she laughs, mocks the possibility of her having a child, and then she lies about it. So the Sras Emes says, no, she didn't laugh consciously. It was subconscious. And that's why she denied it, because she consciously did not laugh. But the fact that she even had subconscious, a trace of doubt, which she herself didn't even realize she had, that itself was something that was lacking, and therefore God calls her out for it and says, you have to erase whatever trace of doubt you can have, even subconsciously. Now we go to the end of the Torah portion. The most controversial and enigmatic story in the Torah, many people would say. And we'll try to explain it as best as we can, at least partially. God is testing Abraham. Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 5, tells us that Abraham was tested 10 times. And we already went through some of the tests. One of the tests was that Lech Lecha, leave your homeland. The earlier test was he resisted worshiping an idol. He was thrown into a fiery furnace. Another test was he was told in the covenant between the pieces that his descendants will be persecuted. He was given many, many tests, very formidable tests. The final test that he was given is where God tells him to take his son, his only son, Isaac, and offer him as an offering on this mountain, Har HaMoriah, which later on became the Temple Mount. And Abraham complies with God's will, and he takes his son and he binds him to the altar. He's ready to slaughter him, and an angel of God calls out and says, no, Abraham, that's not what God meant. You passed the test, and instead he brings this ram as a sacrifice instead of Isaac. So this story, many people have troubled by this story, because why would God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? Isn't child worship such a despicable thing? Isn't it anathema? Isn't it something that Judaism of all religions always militated against, while in other religions, even in relatively modern times, they had this concept of human sacrifices? Judaism never had that concept, and yet God tells him to sacrifice his son. Well, the simple answer to that is God never told him to sacrifice his son. God told him to bring him up as an ola. Ola means going up. And indeed, he went up. He went up to the mountain to perform this ritual. But God never told him to literally sacrifice his son. That's the simple answer, that this was only a test. But let's try to understand it a little bit more deeply. There's a passage in the Talmud that says that when Abraham was given this test, God said to Abraham, please pass this test, because if you don't pass this test, everyone will say there was no substance to the other tests. What does that mean? No substance to the other tests? Just because you have 10 tests and you passed 9 with flying colors, but you failed the most difficult test, that makes all the other earlier tests worthless? So the Hasidic explanation is that all the tests that Abraham was asked to perform were tests about how dedicated Abraham was to the agenda, to God's agenda. God's agenda was to promote the idea of monotheism and righteousness and morality, which Abraham did. And he did it very successfully and very efficiently. But in each of those tests, Abraham was furthering and advancing the cause for which he devoted his life. We find in every culture, even in evil cultures, people who are so dedicated to the culture that they're willing to give everything, life and limb, for the furtherance and advancement of their culture. You had suicide bombers, you had kamikazes. These are people who were so brainwashed into believing that this is the right cause, And if it's the right cause, some people will give something for it, some people will give everything for it. And that's what Abraham was doing with all the 9 tests. He was advancing his cause. The cause was do what God wants you to do to make the world a godly place, to get people to become moral and righteous and ethical. When he came to the 10th test, everything was turned on its head. God is telling him to do something that is so contrary to the whole agenda. This is the agenda was to promote righteousness. Is this righteous? To sacrifice your son? Number one. Number two, is this going to make people say, wow, we love this religion that Abraham is promoting, and we're going to flock to it? No, it's going to turn people off. People will be so turned off by it that everything Abraham accomplished in his lifetime will go down the drain. Furthermore, this was so confusing. God tells Abraham, you're going to have children, you're going to have descendants, and there'll be descendants from Isaac. Isaac wasn't married yet, so he had no children. And now he's going to kill Isaac? So that means that God contradicts himself. This was such a theological and an emotional conflict. But yet God gave him the order to do it. It made no sense. It went against everything that his whole life was devoted to. So that's why if he couldn't pass this test, what are people going to say? People are going to say, you're no different from any other culture in which people are so devoted to the culture, they'll do anything to further it, to advance it. But here he's asked to do something that will abort his culture, his life's work, to get rid of it. That's something that requires a higher level of consciousness, a higher level of devotion to God. And when Abraham demonstrated that, they knew that all of his other actions were not just a product of a brainwashed fanatic fighting for his cause, but it's the product of someone who internalized God's mission and devoted his life to doing because it's God's mission. It's what God said, not what you want to do. It's not because it's your agenda, it's because it's God's agenda. That's one explanation. Another explanation given by a great Talmudic sage of the 19th century, known as the Marsham. The book is known as Tchelis Mardchai. He says the following, that, and I'm going to do it very briefly, that when someone is told to do something spiritually, emotionally, physically very difficult because it's God's will, there are 2 ways of doing it. Most people have only one way, but some people have 2 ways. If you're a very spiritual person, spiritual people, holy people, are able to rise above the physical constraints of nature, and they don't feel the pain, they don't relate to their natural emotions the same way. It's like a person who gets an anesthetic. They don't feel the pain. They're desensitized to it. There's a story that happened during World War I believe. One of the Hasidic Rebbes, known as the Munkatcher Rebbe, these were Rebbes, a dynasty that focused mostly on spiritual music, on singing, on song. And each of these Munkatcher Rebbes composed hundreds of melodies. Well, I don't remember which one of these Rebbes it was, but he had to undergo surgery and there was no anesthetic. And he said to them, I'm going to start singing a song. It's a long song. I think it takes about 20 minutes to a half hour to sing. When I get to the certain part of the song, he told them which part, start cutting. And indeed, when he got to that part, they performed the surgery. He didn't feel any pain. He had so elevated himself into a trance-like state that he was oblivious to the physical pain that you normally feel when someone puts a knife in you. Spiritual people could rise above the physical world. A prophet, how did they get prophecy? They couldn't be in their physical state of being. They had to take off their garments, metaphorically. They had to get rid of their normal state of consciousness. They had to rise above their state of consciousness. They couldn't be awake. They had to fall into a trance-like state. And that's what Abraham could have done. Abraham could have suppressed his love for his child and his feeling of abhorrence to the idea of taking a life of anyone, is certainly not his own child that he fathered at the age of 99, 100. So Abraham could have withdrawn from the physical world and gone into this trance-like state, and that way Abraham would have not felt the difficulty involved, because he is now in a spiritual realm. And God says, no, I don't want that. I want you to be in your natural state when your love for your child is at its peak. That's why God says to him, take your son, your only son, the son that you love. That means I want you not to try to forget about your love, withdraw from that emotion. I want you to be fully engrossed in your love for your son, and in spite of that, be prepared to do the opposite and take his life. That would prove to the world that even within this physical world, you have the ability to overcome and resist whatever natural tendencies you have. And that's why it says in the Torah that he saddled his donkey. The word donkey in Hebrew, chamor, also means material. He didn't withdraw from the material. He saddled the material. He controlled it. He was able to control his natural tendencies, and thereby he was able to fulfill and pass this test. That's why the Talmud says that people could say, if you don't pass this test, the other test has no substance. The Hebrew word there is mamish. Mamish means substance, but it also means physicality, something you could touch. People will say, if you don't pass this test because you withdrew from the physical world so you shouldn't feel any pain, they're going to say, just like this test, there was no substance, none of the tests were really fair. You didn't pass any test. You're just able to drug yourself spiritually not to feel the difficulties involved in all these tests. And Abraham overcame that. And the Talmud says, the Midrash says, that there are 3 references to donkeys, and they're all the same donkey. Abraham's donkey, Moses' donkey, and Moshiach's donkey. So Rabbi Shvadron explains that we're not talking about the same physical donkey. Obviously, this donkey had to have enjoyed longevity, which would have been a great miracle, that the donkey is around for thousands of years, and God doesn't do miracles for no good reason. What it means over here is the donkey is a metaphor for the physical world. Abraham was able to do what he had to do to pass the test without removing the physical world, but on the contrary, within the constraints of the physical world, within his nature. Same thing with Moses. Moses, the Rambam writes, Maimonides writes, was a unique prophet. He didn't have to go into a trance. He would stand, he would be talking to God like you're talking to your fellow, like another person. He was totally in the moment, totally in the state of consciousness, of a physical consciousness. And in that state, he was able to receive his prophecy from God. So he had a relationship with his donkey, with his physical existence. And Moshiach, likewise, it says, will be a poor man riding on a donkey. Again, it doesn't mean literally necessarily that he'll be riding a donkey, but it means he is on the donkey, he is on the physical world and controlling it and exercising control. And that's the basic lesson, that Judaism doesn't want us to withdraw from the world, to meditate until we're no longer. Meditation does have its place in Judaism, but the idea, the goal is not to withdraw from the world so you're not affected by it. The idea is to get inspiration so you could go back down into the world and make the world a better place, a godly place. That's the ultimate goal of the Messianic age, when we will all be riding on our donkey. Have a good evening.